bar, that is Bodhshala. They have a very significant component of play activities, unlike any of the other programs. So, and if you look at formal teaching, you will find very little of it, and so that kind of explains the play-based activities complemented by very little formal teaching. I'm not here to make a case for Bodhshala. I'm sure Sasha will do it himself. But what comes out from our study, and I would like to tell him, is that the children who came in from the Bodhshala, of course their numbers were much less, were much ahead in school readiness competencies. So what this throws up for us is that there is a lot of potential in even affordable programs being potentially very good quality. It's not supposed to be necessarily an expensive proposition. How is a day spent in different kinds of schools? Again, you can see those tall bars. It's all formal teaching all the time. And this goes across different age groups. It goes across different programs. It's either formal teaching or, as I've already said, no activity or routine activity. If you look at play-based activities, you see those tiny bars. These are some of the pictures that you can see. These are for Anganwadis in different states, and you can see the infrastructure. It's a reasonably large-sized classrooms. There is pictures on the wall, not necessarily always related to early childhood education, but there is some decoration. But what is missing is not too many children. What is happening in the private preschools, on the contrary? You find limited infrastructure. If you see the picture with the children in a kind of an assembly, there, if you look at the back of it, you'll find the dilapidated infrastructure, but look at the hordes of children that are there. So this is the scenario. Here, this is something from the innovative practices in Andhra and Rajasthan, where without expensive materials and infrastructure, so much can be done with these little children, which will make a difference to their lives and give them a sound foundation. This is a government primary school. Again, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of investment, number of children, many of them sitting underage with no provision of curriculum for these children, because the parents believe that the education happens in schools, not in Anganwadis. A linear regression that was done shows very clearly that the quality of the early childhood program is very significantly correlated with school readiness at age 5. So what are the implications? One, as I said, was that majority of the children are going either to Anganwadis or to private preschools. And these private preschools are in rural areas. They are what are known today as affordable private schools. And we find that the quality across the board is very poor. At age 4, migration to private schools, I've already said, is migration from Anganwadis to private schools or as underage children is a matter of concern, not because they're going to private schools, but what are they going in for? Our data shows that preschools and schools, this is answering the question, are schools ready for children? They are not ready for children, either as preschools or schools. As already mentioned, across programs, the dominant practice is formal teaching of the 3 Rs or routine activity. Outdoor play, something so essential for children as their bones and muscles are developing, is missing completely from these programs. They don't have space, perhaps, or it is not safe. And what parents consider as good quality, affordable private preschools are actually, we said, not good quality. But how do we convince the parents? That is a big question. Then again, there is not much progression from one age to another, which is again very, very much a matter of concern because there is no age appropriateness about the curriculum. So if a child comes in at 2, the child learns the same thing in rote form as a child would learn later. School readiness emerges from our study as a very critical factor in later learning. When we're talking about children not learning to read and write in primary schools, we can see the genesis of that problem is with school readiness not being there because many of the children are first-generation learners who don't have that home support to be able to give them that necessary foundation. But unfortunately, this component is missing from the curriculum across the board. And what we see, because we followed up the children till age 8, that is where we have ended this year, we find a significant impact of the quality of preschool education on children up to that age. Coming to the final slide of recommendations, what we say is that there is a need to really acknowledge that there is a link between school learning and preschool school readiness. When we see in all the policy documents, there is no association seen between the two. One may be emphasized in isolation from the other. What one worries about is that there's a lot of investment going into mobiles, technology, which is all very good, into teacher training and so on, all inputs at the primary level or the school level, without actually addressing the issue where it really rests, which is seeing that the child is ready for school, and the child cannot be ready for school, making the child ready for making the school ready for the children. So that the curriculum is never revisited in terms of its age appropriateness or developmental appropriateness. It is not basically seen, there aren't enough studies which would show how children are actually responding to the kind of curriculum that they are coming in with. When we only see the dropout rates, we understand that this could be one factor. Regulation of quality of private preschools is imperative because large-scale migration is happening there. And lastly, an effective professional teacher preparation is key to the whole quality. What we find is that ultimately it is the teacher, irrespective of everything else, that will make a difference. So how do we prepare teachers who are professionally, personally competent enough to be able to have conviction in what they are doing? One of the problems one finds is that teachers themselves are not confident of what they are doing if they are not following the bandwagon. So how do we make teachers reflect, understand, and be convinced about what is meant by age and developmentally appropriate classroom practices and pedagogy, and then be able to deliver it. Have the autonomy to be able to defend their own classroom practices. So these are some of the recommendations that are coming. Last of all, I'd just like to share with you that one of the teacher education programs that we are proposing from Ambedkar University currently for Delhi is a BA, B.Ed, which has one trajectory which will be pre-primary and primary, and the other will be upper primary and secondary. So we are somewhere delinking primary from upper primary because we feel that the needs and the characteristics of children from pre-primary and primary are much more in continuity, whereas the needs from upper primary and secondary are more homogeneous. And therefore, we are hoping to launch this program from Ambedkar University. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kaul. There are some very interesting observations that emerge out of your study, which we shall be discussing when a slotted time for that is utilized. I will invite now our second speaker, Dr. Suman Bhattacharjee. Dr. Suman Bhattacharjee has been Director Research at ASER Center, New Delhi since 2008. ASER Center is the research and evaluation unit of Pratham Education Foundation, responsible for facilitating the nationwide annual status of education reports, among other research, assessment, and capacity building initiatives. Dr. Suman has worked as a software developer, a high school teacher, an education specialist, and a researcher. She has extensive experience in the field of education, gender and women's rights, and has worked with government, private, non-government, and international organizations in several countries, including India, the United States, Pakistan, and Mexico. She has taught courses on research design, gender, and education. Dr. Suman earned an undergraduate degree in economics with honors from Delhi University and master's and doctoral degree in education from Harvard University. Dr. Suman, I call upon you. Dr. Suman.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to apologize for the fact that the title of my presentation is actually not the title that you have in your program. When Vinita invited me to present at this conference, she wanted me to talk about some of the conclusions of a study that we did a few years ago titled Inside Primary Schools. And I will be talking about some of those findings, but I have updated some of that material and added some more data sources. So I thought the presentation deserved a new title. And so I thought I'd start by confusing you, or else you will decide that I don't know how to count, because the title is What's Wrong with This Picture? But there are actually 3 pictures in front of you. Now, as people who work in the field of education and concerned with quality, you look at any of those pictures and you can think immediately about features or characteristics of these 3 classrooms or these 3 groups of students that are missing if you are thinking about quality education in early grades. But the kinds of features that I want to talk to you about in the next 10 or 15 minutes are features that are not visible. So you can't look at a photograph necessarily and tell that they're not there, but they do make up a very important assumptions when we think about schooling, and therefore they do affect the kinds of actions that we recommend and the kinds of policies that we want to implement when we think about improving outcomes, improving either building foundations or improving quality in primary schools. So I want to begin just by thinking for a minute about how we imagine a typical classroom in a primary school. And here I've just chosen Standard 2. We could have chosen any class. But usually if you ask somebody to come up with a picture of what do you think about when you think about a typical Standard 2 classroom, you would think about a Standard 2 teacher teaching from a Standard 2 textbook using child-friendly methods, hopefully, and teaching a group of Standard 2 students. Those students, you would expect, the ones who are enrolled in the school, to be present in that classroom. You would expect that since this is a Standard 2 classroom, they should be more or less 7 years old. You would expect that because they're in Standard 2, they would know and understand the content that they were exposed to in Standard 1, and that if they don't understand something, that hopefully their parents or somebody in their family can help them. So this is sort of a very common image that we have about a classroom in a primary school. The problem is that when we start looking at the evidence, almost all of these assumptions turn out to be wrong. And so policies or suggestions for action to improve quality that are based on these assumptions may not end up producing the desired outcomes. So I just want to take you all through a few of these assumptions and look at the data to think about how they're wrong, and then come back to the question of if we want to build strong foundations and improve quality, then how should we be thinking about designing policy? So here's our first assumption, that children enter Standard 1 at age 6. This has already been mentioned by my colleague Rukmini in the morning, and also by Venita in this just before me. And this is data from the latest annual status of education report from 2014. For those of you who are not familiar with the ASER survey, this is an annual survey of children's learning status and schooling status that reaches over 600,000 children every year. And as both Rukmini and Venita mentioned, we see that very large numbers of children younger than 6 are already in school. Now, ASER doesn't ask the question of 3- and 4-year-olds, but for 5-year-olds, we see here that there are more 5-year-olds in primary school than there are in preschool. So there's some 50-odd% in primary school, and about 40% here in preschool. Now this, as I said, we don't have data in ASER on younger children, but from the study, the Early Childhood Education Impact Study, we see very clearly that at age 4, many children are already in primary school. But not only that, we see very large variations across the country. So the picture in Rajasthan, which is what is in this graph, which is showing that almost 15% of children age 4 are in primary school, looks very different from the picture in Assam, which shows that age 4, there are almost no children in primary school, and almost all children are in preschools, mostly in Anganwadis. I didn't have space, but we have data from Telangana as well. So what this is saying is that not only is there are our children not doing what our policies say they should be doing, but that our states are very different from each other in what children do, how they move through these early years of preschool and primary school. And this has important impact on how we think about what we should be doing with these children and where we should be doing it. The second assumption is that children in each class are fairly homogeneous. So obviously, if we are talking about building foundations or ensuring quality in our classrooms, then we need to be talking about the children who we have in our classrooms. Now, in the image that I discussed right at the beginning of this presentation, we assume that children are pretty much the same age. So we just saw, and here's some more data on children's age distribution. We're looking this time at standard 2. Again, this is USSR 2014 data. Now, if according to RTE, children should be age 7 in standard 2, USSR tells us that just about 40% of children in standard 2 are 7. About another 40% are older than 7, and 20% are younger. And there's a huge spread in age, the range of ages in standard 2 classrooms, ranging from 5 all the way to more than 10, say 11 or 12. Now, why is this important? Because when we're thinking about what teachers should do in classrooms to ensure foundations, to improve quality, it's not the same if you have a group of 5-year-olds or even a couple of 5-year-olds in your classroom, and if you have a 10 or an 11 or a 12-year-old. What you do, how you think about it, the activities you undertake will be different. So this huge range in age has major implications for how we think about what teachers have to do to ensure that their children achieve the outcomes that we want them to achieve. Now, this is if we think about the age range within a single class. But we also know from USSR that there is, in most schools, no such thing as a standard 2 classroom. So USSR reaches about 15,000 schools, government primary schools every year. And one of the things we look at is whether classrooms are single grade or multi-grade. And as you can see from this graph here, for the last many years, standard 2 classrooms in the majority of schools in India are not single grade classrooms. So there's a teacher who's not only dealing with a very large range of ages of her own children in standard 2, but also has at least one other group of students in the same classroom with an equally probably large spread of ages and everything else. So, just the complexity of the teacher's task in this classroom is something that is really, really a difficult job for any teacher. And finally, we also often hear in schools that students don't study, parents don't help them, they don't do their homework, etc., etc. But if you look at the characteristics of children's parents and the homes that they come from, what we see is, this is again, I said 2014 data, almost 50% of children in standard 2 in 2014 had mothers who had never been to schools themselves. Never. Now, this does not mean, of course, that mothers and parents and family members cannot participate in their children's education. Of course they can. What it means is that as a system, or as education systems, we have to think about ways to communicate with these parents, to interact with these parents, to engage them in their children's learning, and think about strategies that are different from those that we would come up with when we are talking about parents who are educated or have experience of schooling. A third assumption I want to talk about, which follows from the previous one about children not being homogeneous in a classroom. There's an assumption we make that if a child is in a given class, he or she has mastered, understood, can handle the content that was taught in earlier years. Now, there's a lot of data to show that this is just not true. It's not just our ASER data, but data from various sources are showing very clearly that there are huge learning gaps among our children. So this data comes from the Inside Primary School study, where we tracked about 24,000 children in 5 different states for 18 months. We tracked children in Standard 2 and in Standard 4. So this data is from Standard 2. This is the end line data. So these children were in Standard 3 when we did this assessment. And these are very, very, as you can see, very simple indicators that we're looking at. Can these children read a 2-letter word? Can they read a Standard 1 level text? Can they add 2 digits, etc.? And these are outcomes that are expected. The curriculum, the textbooks expect children to be able to do this in Standard 1 and 2. And what we're seeing here is that there are huge, huge gaps between what the curriculum expects and what children are able to do. Similar data for Standard 5. Again, the indicators that I'm using here are outcomes that the curriculum expects children to have mastered in Standards 3 and 4. And the proportion of children who have mastered these competencies is way under. It's not even close to 50%, let alone 100%. Now, the thing is that it's not that these children are all at a uniform level of learning. It's not that all of them, it's not that 40% of children can read 2-letter words and 40% can read nothing at all. There's a whole range of learning outcomes in a single classroom. And our assumption also is that the textbooks that we use in our schools are designed for the children who are in those classrooms. But the problem is that children are very varied, as you've just seen, in what they can do. So this is, again, ASER data. This is now Standard 5. And what we see here is that less than 50% of children in Standard 5 can read a Standard 2 level text. This is a finding that has been constant from ASER for the last 10 years. There's been no change in that finding. But it's not just that. There's some children who can read grade 1 level text. There's some children who can read letters but not more. There's some children who can read simple words. And there are some children that can read nothing at all. All of these children are in the same classroom, being taught the same curriculum. But the textbook, and this is an actual extract of a language textbook for Standard 5, you can see that the language here, both the length, the complexity, and so on, is much harder than what these children can do. So again, if we want children to learn, if we want to build foundations, then we have to provide materials that are designed around what children can do and build from there, not assume that children can handle the level of complexity that we think that they ought to be able to handle. 2 more assumptions to do with teachers. One is, it's very common to hear people say this: oh, primary school, young children, anybody can teach, right? Actually, as anyone who has ever taught in primary school knows, it's a very difficult job. And so in the Inside Primary School study, in addition to looking at children and classrooms and home backgrounds and so on, we did actually test teachers as well. And we used items in that assessment that were similar to the items we were using with children in grade 4. So that level of difficulty. So these are 2 examples of questions in the math portion of the assessment. As you can see, these are questions that you would expect children to be exposed to in Standard 2 or 3. And you would hope that any primary school teacher, whether or not she is teaching math, should be able to solve these questions. Now, unfortunately, that is very, very far from the truth. And I've put the data here state-wise because there are states in the sample that we think of as very poor in terms of educational quality. And there are states in the sample that we often think of as relatively good in terms of education quality in this country. And you can see the proportion of teachers who solved these two questions correctly. So it's not that all our teachers know all of the content that they're expected to transact with students, even at lower primary grades. But beyond content knowledge, what we also did in this study was to look at other aspects of what teachers should be able to do if they're going to be able to successfully help their students build strong foundations. So we looked at whether teachers could spot mistakes that are commonly made by students. We looked at whether teachers could explain concepts in simple language, because if you're working with young children, you need to be able to explain things in simple language. And unfortunately, I don't have the data here with me in front of me today, but those numbers are even worse in terms of how teachers did in terms of their ability to either spot mistakes being made by students or explain concepts